The pain behind Chester Bennington's voice wasn't just something people heard in his music. It was something he had been carrying long before the world ever listened. His voice sounded powerful, sharp, and unforgettable. But underneath that power lived a kind of hurt that never learned how to stay silent. It was the type of pain that forces its way out even when the person holding it has no idea how to talk about it. Jung once said that when a person can't face their own suffering, the shadow inside them finds another way to speak. Through art, through behavior, through the things they create before they're ready to understand themselves. And that's exactly why Chester's voice felt different. It wasn't just singing. It wasn't just performance. It was a warning disguised as melody, a confession hidden inside screams the world mistook for entertainment. His voice carried the weight of everything he couldn't explain: childhood wounds, inner battles, loneliness he didn't know where to put, and pain he tried to outrun but couldn't. And because of that, his music wasn't simply emotional. It was honest in a way that felt almost uncomfortable, like hearing someone's heart break in real time. Sometimes pain finds a voice before the person does, and long before the world understood what he was going through, Chester's voice had already been telling the truth. But that truth started much earlier, back in the place where his hurt first began. Before Chester ever found music, he was already growing up in a world that didn't give him the safety every child needs. His early environment wasn't shaped by stability or consistent comfort. It was shaped by moments that confused him, scared him, and forced him to grow up long before he was ready. For most kids, home is the first place where they learn trust. For Chester, it became a place where he learned to brace himself. Psychologists talk about adverse childhood experiences, events that change how a young brain develops. When children go through trauma, the brain begins to operate in survival mode. Instead of exploring the world with curiosity, they learn to scan it for danger. Instead of feeling worthy, they feel responsible for everything that goes wrong. Chester's nervous system adapted the same way. He didn't become sensitive or anxious because he wanted to. His body was reacting to the unpredictable environment he grew up in. Attachment theory explains another layer of his struggle. Kids form emotional templates based on how their caregivers respond to them. When affection and fear come from the same place, the mind learns a pattern called disorganized attachment, wanting closeness but expecting pain. As an adult, this can show up as confusion in relationships, quick emotional shifts, and a constant fear of disappointing others. These weren't personality flaws in Chester. They were wounds from a childhood where support wasn't always reliable. Carl Jung described something called the wounded inner child, the part of a person that stays stuck at the age their deepest pain began. Time moves forward, but that scared version of you remains inside, waiting for the care it never received. Chester carried that inner child everywhere he went. Even later in life, when he appeared confident and creative, there was still a younger version of him inside. A boy who never had the chance to feel fully safe. These early wounds didn't disappear as he grew older. They shaped how he saw himself, how he trusted others, and how quickly he blamed himself when things went wrong. They followed him into friendships, relationships, and eventually into the art he created. Long before the world connected with his voice, his childhood had already carved out the emotional terrain he would spend the rest of his life trying to climb. So when success finally arrived, it didn't land on an empty surface. It landed on those same old wounds he had been carrying since he was a boy. And that's why fame didn't feel like freedom for him. The crowds grew, the stages got bigger, and suddenly his voice was everywhere. But the hurt inside him didn't shrink with the spotlight. If anything, fame made the pain echo even louder. Success came fast, and with it came expectations. To perform, to stay strong, to be the same powerful voice night after night. For most people, fame looks like the finish line. But for someone who grew up without stability, the spotlight can feel overwhelming. Chester suddenly had to hold himself together in front of entire arenas, even on days when he barely felt steady in private. The world was cheering, but he still felt the same emotional uncertainty he had been carrying for years. Psychologists talk about something called the hedonic treadmill, the idea that no matter how exciting something is at first, the feeling fades and a person returns to their old emotional baseline. Fame works the same way. At first, Chester felt the rush of performing, the joy of connecting with fans, the thrill of creating something powerful. But those highs didn't last. They couldn't touch the deeper wounds he had never been able to heal. The applause was loud, but the relief was temporary. Neuroscience explains why. Fame brings constant spikes of dopamine, the brain's reward chemical. But after a while, the brain adapts. It stops reacting as strongly. Things that once felt exciting now feel normal. And when a person already lives with heavy emotional pain, that normal can feel like a sudden drop. Chester wasn't losing passion. His brain was exhausted from constantly being pushed into extreme highs and lows. Stoic philosophy warns that external validation can never fix internal suffering. Fame can make a person visible to the world, but it can't make them feel whole. Chester was praised for his talent, admired for his honesty, and loved for his music. Yet, he still felt pressure to keep being the strong, powerful voice everyone expected. The spotlight didn't erase the cracks inside him. It simply made them harder to hide. What the world saw was a star rising higher and higher. What Chester felt was that the higher he went, the more dangerous the fall became. Fame didn't heal the pain he carried. It only made the contrast sharper. The loudness of the world around him and the quiet heaviness he still held inside. And that quiet heaviness became the place where his real battle lived, not on the stage, but in his own mind. On the inside, Chester wasn't dealing with fame. He was dealing with thoughts that didn't give him a break. These weren't small worries or the kind of sadness a good night of sleep could fix. They were heavy, sharp, and unpredictable, like emotional waves that kept knocking him down even on days when everything looked fine on the outside. For someone who has lived through deep hurt, the mind can slowly turn into a battlefield. Chester often talked about how he didn't trust his own thoughts, how they could shift suddenly, and how quickly they could drag him into darker places. This wasn't about weakness. It was about carrying emotional pain for so long that his thoughts had developed their own momentum. Once they started, it was hard to slow them down. Psychologists describe a painful pattern that many people fall into, the cycle of escape. When the mind gets too loud, a person looks for ways to quiet it, through distraction, substances, or anything that gives even a moment of relief. But once that brief relief fades, guilt creeps in. And when guilt hits, the same loud thoughts return even stronger, pushing the person back into the same escape they were trying to avoid. Chester knew this cycle too well. He wasn't hiding it. He spoke about it openly, almost like he was trying to warn people how dangerous the cycle could become. Neuroscience explains another layer of his struggle. The part of the brain responsible for internal thoughts, the default mode network, can become overactive in people dealing with long-term emotional pain. When that happens, the mind doesn't rest. It replays memories, fears, regrets, and worst-case scenarios like an endless loop. Chester wasn't choosing to think these things. His brain simply wouldn't stop feeding them to him. It was like being stuck with an inner voice that kept pointing back to old pain, even when he wanted to move forward. Jung described this kind of struggle as the shadow turning inward, not just expressing hidden pain, but actively fighting the self. Chester lived with that fight every day. On stage, he looked powerful. In interviews, he looked calm. But inside, he was up against thoughts that felt bigger than him, thoughts that made even normal days feel like climbing uphill with no rest. These weren't temporary moments. They were constant, invisible battles happening behind the very voice the world admired. And while millions felt strength in his music, only Chester knew how much effort it took just to keep going inside his own mind. And even beyond those inner battles, there was another weight he carried, a quieter kind of pain that followed him everywhere, the feeling of being alone, even when he wasn't. It didn't matter if he was on stage, in a studio, or sitting with people he loved. There was a space inside him no one else could reach. And that emptiness stayed with him more often than anyone realized. A lot of this came from the emotional patterns formed earlier in his life. When someone grows up without steady comfort, their mind doesn't automatically trust closeness later on. Even real love can feel distant. Support can feel temporary. Warmth can feel unfamiliar. Chester wanted connection, just like anyone else, but a part of him struggled to believe he truly belonged in it. So even when people stood beside him, a quiet part of him stayed apart. Not by choice, but by habit. Existential psychologists like Viktor Frankl and Rollo May write about a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from feeling like no one can truly see what you're carrying. Chester lived with that kind of loneliness every day. He could laugh, talk, and work with people he cared about, but the deeper parts of him, the ones shaped long ago, stayed untouched. He once admitted he could be in a room full of loved ones and still feel completely lost inside himself. That wasn't drama. It was a real disconnect he didn't know how to fix. Buddhism teaches that suffering grows when we feel separated, from others, from the world, or from ourselves. Chester carried that separation quietly. It didn't show up in dramatic breakdowns. It showed up in the gentle ways he held back, in the hesitation before opening up, in the moments where he blamed himself for things he could never control. It was a loneliness that hid behind small smiles and soft voices, the kind that sits in the background even on good days. And this quiet emptiness didn't stay inside him. It slipped into the emotion of his voice, not through the loud moments, but through the softer ones. People didn't just hear sadness in his songs, they felt it. They felt the ache that comes from wanting connection, but never fully feeling it land. The loneliness he carried became the part of his music that touched millions, because it wasn't exaggerated or performed. It was real. It was lived. And the more it showed in his voice, the more that voice became the only place where his pain felt safe enough to come out. That same heaviness he carried into every room eventually found the one place it couldn't hide: his voice. Music became the space where everything he struggled with finally had somewhere to go. Not because he planned it that way, but because his emotions needed a way out long before he knew how to explain them. When Chester sang, something inside him loosened, like a pressure valve releasing what his mind couldn't hold anymore. Therapists often say that expression comes before language. People who carry deep emotional pain don't always talk about it first. They show it through sound, movement, or creativity. Chester was exactly that. His voice wasn't shaped by technique or training as much as it was shaped by the weight he had been carrying since childhood. The tremble in the quiet notes, the break in the middle of a line, the raw intensity of a scream. None of it was performance. It was emotion escaping through the only channel he trusted. Neuroscience explains why his voice felt different, even to strangers. When someone sings, the parts of the brain that hold emotional memories and unprocessed feelings become active. Sound pulls those memories up, whether a person wants them or not. Chester wasn't acting when he sang. His brain was doing what it naturally does when emotions have been trapped for too long. It let them out through his voice. That's why his singing felt so real. It wasn't filtered. It wasn't softened. It came from the same places that were hurting. Carl Jung believed that when a person carries a heavy shadow, the hidden part of them filled with pain, fear, and memories, it eventually finds a way to express itself. Chester's shadow didn't stay silent. It showed itself in the tone of his voice, in the cracks he couldn't control, in the moments where it sounded like he was fighting something no one else could see. His voice wasn't just singing lyrics, it was giving shape to feelings he couldn't organize into words. He didn't need to say, "I'm hurting." His voice said it for him. Every time he stepped up to a microphone, the truth he carried slipped out before he could pull it back. And millions felt something in that honesty, because his voice simply refused to lie, even when he wished it would. But offstage, that honesty didn't come as easily. The same man whose voice revealed everything learned to hide most of it in his everyday life. For millions of people, Chester's music was the place where pain finally felt understood. But in his everyday life, there was a different version of him, one the world rarely saw. Around others, he laughed, joked, and carried himself with a warmth that made people feel comfortable. He wasn't pretending to be someone else. He was protecting people from the weight he didn't know how to share. Psychologists call this masking, the quiet, exhausting habit of acting fine so no one has to worry. People do it for many reasons: to keep the mood light, to avoid becoming a burden, or simply because they don't have the energy to explain what's going on inside. Chester often stepped into that role effortlessly. In interviews, he played the funny one. During rehearsals, he tried to keep the room easy and calm. With friends, he hid the heaviness because he didn't want them to carry it with him. There's a known archetype called the wounded healer, someone who helps others through the very pain they're struggling with themselves. Chester embodied that without ever meaning to. His music gave people strength. His vulnerability inspired fans to keep going, and his empathy made countless listeners feel less alone. But giving that kind of comfort often meant he had nothing left for himself. It's easy to guide others through darkness. It's harder to admit you're still standing in your own. Part of the pressure he carried came from the world's idea of strength. People sometimes think strength means not showing hurt, not asking for help, not letting anyone see the cracks. That misunderstanding has been around for centuries, a distorted version of stoicism that teaches people to hide their pain instead of working through it. Chester felt that pressure deeply. He knew millions saw him as a fighter, a voice of resilience, someone who had already survived so much. Admitting he was still struggling felt like failing the role he never asked for. But hiding pain is its own kind of exhaustion. Every smile that comes from force instead of joy, every joke used to cover fear, Every relaxed expression used to calm others. All of it drains a person faster than the world realizes. Chester wasn't lying when he acted okay. He was trying to shield the people around him from emotions he didn't want to pass on, even as those emotions kept growing heavier inside him. But even a loving mask takes a toll. It slowly wore down the strength he had left. At some point, the storm inside Chester stopped being something he could simply live around. For years, he had been carrying too many things at once. The old hurt from his past, the demands of success, the pressure to stay strong for others, and the constant effort of keeping his darkest thoughts under control. That kind of strain doesn't disappear. It slowly wears a person down. Bit by bit, his energy to keep fighting, to keep masking, to keep showing up the way everyone expected began to fade. It wasn't about one bad day or one sudden change. It was a long, quiet draining of his emotional strength. When new stress lands on top of old wounds, the past doesn't stay in the past. It comes back sharper. Psychologists call this trauma resurfacing, not because someone is weak, but because their mind has already carried more than it was ever designed to hold. For Chester, certain losses, pressures, and turning points in his later years didn't just hurt in the moment. They pulled on everything he had already survived. Old beliefs about not being enough, old fears of failing the people he loved, old feelings of being alone with his pain. All of it could come rushing back at once. In that state, a person doesn't just feel sad. They feel swallowed by something that seems endless. In clinical psychology, there's a pattern sometimes called quiet suicidality. It doesn't always look like chaos from the outside. Sometimes, when a person has reached their limit, they actually seem calmer. They keep working. They answer messages. They smile in photos. They say they're okay because they don't know what else to say. Inside, though, their emotional resources are empty. Their mind, overwhelmed by years of fear, guilt, exhaustion, and hopelessness, starts looking for a way to stop the pain. Not because they don't love the people around them, but because they can't imagine a future where they themselves feel at peace. That's what cognitive overload can do. When the brain has been under pressure for too long, it stops being able to hold everything together. Small decisions feel impossible. Normal days feel unbearable. The person may still move through their routines, but internally, they're running on fumes. That's why people are often shocked after a tragedy like Chester's. They remember the last time they saw him and say, "He seemed better," or "I never thought he would do something like that." From the outside, it can look like things are settling. Inside, the person may already feel like they've reached the end of what they can carry. The truth is, we will never fully know what those last days felt like from his perspective. We only see fragments. The love he had for his family, the care he had for his bandmates, the honesty he shared about his struggles, and the weight he had been holding for so many years. What we can see, looking back, is a man who gave everything he had, not just to music, but to everyone who needed his voice to survive their own darkness. By the time his collapse came, it wasn't the beginning of his pain. It was the final chapter of a battle he had been fighting almost his entire life. A battle the world only tried to truly understand after it was already too late. When Chester passed, the world started replaying his performances, interviews, and lyrics. And suddenly, so many things that once felt like art started to look like evidence. The pain in his voice, the way he joked through discomfort, the way he talked about not trusting his own mind, it was all there. His story forces us to face something uncomfortable. We are often better at admiring someone's strength than noticing their suffering. His life shows how easily we confuse silence with resilience. Real Stoic wisdom was never about hiding pain. It was about meeting reality honestly and supporting one another through it. But somewhere along the way, we turned being strong into don't talk about it. Chester became a symbol of survival for millions, and that made it even harder for people to imagine how much he was still struggling inside. His story asks us to rewrite what we call strength, from holding everything in to having the courage to be honest and the kindness to let others be honest too. Buddhist thought says that suffering is something all humans share, but the illusion of being alone in it makes that suffering heavier. Chester's loneliness, his overthinking, his effort to protect everyone else from his darkness, all of it reflects how many people look fine while feeling like they are barely holding on. Research on empathy shows that we are especially likely to miss the pain of people who are high functioning, the ones who perform well, make others laugh, get things done, and never quite let their mask slip. Chester was that person for so many people around him. The lesson his life leaves us with is not just about him, It's about us, about how we treat the people who seem strong and how we treat ourselves. It's a reminder to check on the friend who always says, "I'm good," to listen when someone hints that they're tired instead of brushing it off as a joke, to take seriously the kind of pain that doesn't show up as drama, but as quiet withdrawal, numbness, or "I'm just tired, it's nothing." Chester's legacy isn't only in the songs that saved people, it's in the warning his story leaves behind. A warning that even the brightest, loudest, most powerful voices can belong to someone who feels alone with their pain. We couldn't change how his story ended, but we can honor him by changing how we respond to the people still here, including ourselves. By remembering that no one, no matter how strong they seem, is meant to carry everything alone. Chester's life doesn't end with tragedy. It ends with a message. His journey reminds us that the people who give us strength often need it just as deeply themselves. What he brought into the world wasn't just music, it was understanding. He turned his hurt into something that helped millions feel less strange, less broken, less alone. And even though he's gone, the truth inside his voice remains, quietly asking us to lead with compassion, both for others and for ourselves. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me in the comments what part of Chester's journey hit you the most. And if you want more videos that dive into stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next.